Nearly 29 million people are already sitting inside a severe weather zone for this coming Friday, and it hasn't even started raining yet. From Washington to Baltimore to Philadelphia, the same setup is quietly loading, and it begins tomorrow with something the North almost never sees: a genuine tornado threat over the forests of New England. One single pattern is doing all of it. A record heat dome in the west, a deep trough in the east, and a river of wind running between them is about to fire hazard after hazard down the east coast for a week. And at the far southern end of it, the Gulf is trying to spin up the season's first homegrown storm from scratch. This is not one storm. It is a pattern, and it is far worse than a typical July storm. If these are the forecasts you would rather understand than fear, do the channel a real favour and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps us reach more people before the weather does. And drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and which of these threats is closest to you: the northern storms, the weekend siege, or the thing building in the Gulf. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The number that should not be there. There is a single number sitting on a weather model right now, hovering over the border between Maine and Quebec, and if you knew what it meant, it would stop you cold. The number is 8. It is called the significant tornado parameter, and it is one of the tools forecasters use to measure how primed the atmosphere is to produce a strong, long-lived tornado. A value of 1 means the ingredients are there. A value of 3 means you should be paying very close attention. A value of 8 over the forests of northern New England is the kind of reading you expect to see on the high plains of Kansas in the middle of May, not over Burlington and Bangor in the middle of July. And yet there it is, forecast for around 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, glowing over a part of the country that almost never sees this. I want to be honest with you about what that means, because the whole story we are going to tell today hangs on it. That number is not a promise that a violent tornado will happen. The atmosphere is not a machine, and it breaks its own rules constantly. But that number is a fingerprint. It is the signature of an environment that has been loaded, cocked, and pointed at a place that is not built to expect it. And here is the part that turns a local severe weather day into something much larger. That reading over Maine is not an accident, and it is not alone. It is the first symptom of a much bigger shift in the weather pattern across the entire country. A shift that is about to end several weeks of relative quiet and, over the next 7 to 10 days, aim a chain of escalating hazards straight at the East Coast. So let me tell you plainly what is forming, because that is what the title of this promised you, and I am not going to make you wait for it. What is forming is not a storm. It is a pattern. Over the next few days, a large dome of heat and high pressure that has been baking the middle of the country is going to slide east, and along its leading edge, the winds high up in the atmosphere are going to turn and accelerate out of the northwest. That flow is the engine. It is what takes cold, storm-generating disturbances and hurls them southeast into warm, humid, unstable air. And once that engine switches on, it does not fire just once. It fires tomorrow over New England. It fires again this weekend over the mid-Atlantic, where nearly 29 million people are already inside a severe weather risk zone for Friday. And then, at the far southern end of this same pattern, over the warm water of the Gulf, something else begins to happen. A front stalls out, energy gets trapped over the ocean, and for the first time in a while, forecasters have started watching the Gulf for a storm that could build itself quite literally from scratch. That is the shape of the next 10 days. A rare tornado threat in the north, a multi-day siege of severe weather up and down the eastern half of the country, and a homegrown tropical system trying to spin up in the south. 3 very different kinds of danger in 3 very different places, and every single one of them is being driven by the same reconfiguration of the jet stream. That is why the title says far worse than a typical July storm. A typical July storm is a single afternoon thunderstorm that rumbles through, drops some rain, and moves on. What is setting up here is not a storm at all. It is the atmosphere rearranging its own furniture, and when it finishes, the entire eastern United States is standing in the path. Now? Why is this happening this week, after a stretch where the severe weather maps had gone quiet, and the biggest story most days was the heat? The answer is that the quiet was never really peace. It was a pause. For the last couple of weeks, the pattern across North America had settled into a kind of standoff, a big ridge of high pressure parked in one place, holding everything in a holding pattern. We talked about this just a few days ago, in our video on why the last 2 weeks of July would be unlike anything most of America was expecting. The point of that video was that a locked pattern does not stay locked forever. Eventually it breaks, and when it breaks, all the energy it was holding back gets released at once. What you are watching this week is that break beginning, and the trigger for the break is coming down out of Canada. A powerful storm system has been sliding across the Canadian prairies, across Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and over the last few days it has already been dropping tornadoes as it goes. That is the disturbance that matters. Tomorrow, as the big dome of high pressure over the Great Plains starts shoving east, the flow around the northern edge of that dome turns sharply out of the northwest, and it grabs the energy coming out of Canada and drives it straight down into New England. That is the collision. Cold, fast-moving air aloft, coming down over a surface that is warm and humid and has been sitting under summer sun. When you stack cold air on top of warm air, you get instability, and instability is the fuel. Add the wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction as you go up through the atmosphere, and you do not just get thunderstorms, you get thunderstorms that rotate. Let me put a little more detail on that Canadian trigger, because it tells you this energy is not theoretical. The system coming south has already been producing tornadoes for days as it tracked across the prairies of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, flat open country where these storms are more expected. Now it is being handed off to a completely different environment. When it crosses into the northeastern states, it moves over terrain that is greener, wetter, and far more humid at the surface, and it does so while the flow aloft turns and accelerates around that western dome. So the disturbance keeps its punch and inherits a fresh supply of low-level moisture at the same time. That is the worst kind of upgrade. You take a storm maker that has already proven it can drop tornadoes and you give it more fuel, in a place with fewer storm shelters and far less muscle memory for what to do. I also want to be scrupulously honest about timeframes, because I am recording this before the event and the atmosphere gets a vote. Everything I am describing about tomorrow is a forecast, and forecasts have error bars. The official outlooks I will walk you through are the considered judgment of the government's severe weather forecasters as of right now, and the tropical odds I will give you later are model probabilities as of the latest runs, not certainties. I will flag the confidence level as we go, because a forecast delivered without its uncertainty is not information, it is theatre, and this channel does not do theatre. What I can tell you with high confidence is the big picture, the pattern itself. The exact aim of any single storm is where the honest uncertainty lives. Here is a detail worth holding on to because it tells you how unusual tomorrow really is. The wind shear forecast over northern New England for tomorrow afternoon is running above 50 knots through the depth of the atmosphere. 50 knots of deep layer shear is a number you associate with classic tornado outbreaks in the Central Plains. It is not a number you associate with Vermont, and the reason it matters is that shear is what separates an ordinary storm from a supercell. In an ordinary storm, the rain-cooled downdraft eventually falls back down into the updraft that feeds the storm, and the storm chokes itself out. But when there is strong shear, the updraft and the downdraft get tilted apart, separated so the storm can keep breathing. It becomes a machine that sustains itself for hours, and it is inside that rotating, self-sustaining structure that the largest hail and the strongest tornadoes are born. So when I tell you that tomorrow, over Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and upstate New York, and just to the north over Quebec and Ontario, the forecast is calling for discrete rotating supercells capable of baseball-sized hail, wind gusts that could top 75 to 80 miles an hour, and a few strong tornadoes rated at least an EF2. I'm not describing a normal July afternoon. Baseball-sized hail nearly 3 inches across, is rare almost anywhere. In New England, it is close to unheard of, and that is exactly why the number 8 over Quebec matters so much. The atmosphere is showing us in advance that it has assembled ingredients in a place and a season where those ingredients almost never come together. But I told you at the start that tomorrow is just the first symptom, and I meant it. Because if this were only about one severe weather day in the north, it would be a story, but it would be a small one. What makes this the biggest story in the country right now is what the same pattern does after Tuesday. The engine does not switch off, it reloads, and it turns its attention south and east, toward the most densely populated corridor in America. To understand how one weather pattern can reach from the forest of Maine all the way down to the beaches of Florida in a single week, we have to go up, way up, to the level where the jet stream lives and look at the machine that is driving all of it. Because once you see the shape of that machine, you will understand why this is not a series of unlucky coincidences. It is one thing, and it is only getting started. Part 2. One wave, many faces. To see what is really happening, you have to stop thinking about the weather as a collection of separate storms and start thinking about it as a single, connected system that wraps around the whole continent. And the best place to see that system is not at the ground. It is about 18,000 feet up, in the rivers of fast-moving air we call the jet stream. Everything that is about to happen this week, every tornado and every flood and every record-breaking temperature, is being choreographed up there by the shape of one enormous wave. Let me describe the shape because it is simple once you can picture it. Imagine the jet stream as a ribbon of wind circling the northern hemisphere. It does not run in a straight line. It buckles north and south into a series of ridges and troughs, like a rope snapped into standing waves. Where the ribbon bulges north, you get a ridge, and underneath a ridge you get sinking air, sunshine, and heat. Where the ribbon dips south, you get a trough, and around a trough you get rising air, clouds, and storms. Right now, and for the next several days, there is a very strong ridge locked in over the western United States, and a sharpening trough digging in over the east. A ridge in the west, a trough in the east. Meteorologists call that a dipole, and it is the single most important fact in this entire forecast. Let me explain why a wave like this gets stuck, because the stuckness is the whole reason these hazards get a chance to actually happen. In a fast, flat jet stream, weather systems race along from west to east, and nothing sits over any one place for long. A storm blows through, it rains, it leaves. But when the jet stream buckles into big, high-amplitude waves, like the ones we have now, the whole pattern slows down and can even stall. Forecasters have names for the most extreme versions of this. When a ridge gets pinched off and surrounded by troughs on either side, forming a shape like the Greek letter omega, they call it an omega block, and blocks can hold for days or even a week or more. The waviness itself is tied to the amplitude. A tall ridge and a deep trough are like a big, slow ocean swell rather than a fast little ripple, and big, slow swells take a long time to pass. That is why this pattern is not going to blow through in an afternoon. It is going to sit and grind and fire hazard after hazard from the same configuration, which is exactly what a loaded pattern does. There is a deeper reason forecasters pay such close attention to these blocking high-amplitude patterns, and it is worth a sentence because it connects to a thread we have followed all summer. A wavier, slower jet stream tends to produce more of these stuck extremes. The heat that will not quit in one place, and the storms that keep training over another. We have talked before about how a warming world may be nudging the jet stream toward exactly this kind of waviness, making stuck patterns more common. I'm not going to relitigate that debate here, and the science on the details is still genuinely contested. But it is worth knowing that the kind of locked dipole driving this week is precisely the kind of pattern that draws scientific attention. Because when the atmosphere gets stuck, ordinary ingredients start producing extraordinary outcomes. Here is why that arrangement is so dangerous. On the eastern side of a western ridge, the air aloft comes screaming down out of the northwest. Picture the clockwise flow around the top of that western dome of high pressure. Air riding over the top and down the far side is pointed southeast, and it accelerates as it goes. This is the northwest flow I mentioned, and it is the thread that ties the whole week together. That flow is a delivery system. It takes disturbances, little packets of storm-making energy, and it conveys them along the eastern flank of the ridge, down toward the east coast, one after another, like packages moving down a line. Tomorrow it delivers the first package to New England. This weekend it delivers a series of them to the Mid-Atlantic and the Ohio Valley. And that is why these events are not separate. They are stops on the same route. Now that western ridge is not just an abstraction on a map. It has a face you have already met. Out west right now, that dome of high pressure is producing some of the most extreme heat of the entire summer. We spent time on this just 2 days ago in our video about the cities staring down all-time record temperatures, and the numbers there were staggering in the literal sense of the word. Highs of 100 to 110 degrees across the Intermountain West and the Northern Plains. Salt Lake City challenging its all-time record high of around 107 degrees. Billings, Montana staring down 108, temperatures running as much as 25 degrees above normal at the peak. I bring this back up not to repeat that video, but because I need you to understand something that connects it to everything else. That heat and this week's East Coast storms are not two different stories. They are the same story, seen from two ends. The heat is the western half of the wave. The storms are what the eastern half of that same wave produces. One dome, one pattern, two completely different kinds of misery. And there is a cruel elegance to how a pattern like this distributes its damage. While the west bakes, and while the east braces for storms, there is a narrow band of the country that is about to have some of the most beautiful weather of the year. This coming Sunday, from the Pacific Northwest through the upper Midwest and into far northern New England, a strong high-pressure system sliding down from Canada is going to deliver clear skies, comfortable temperatures in the upper 70s and low 80s, and air so dry the dew points drop into the low 50s. Portland, Oregon and Bangor, Maine, on the same gorgeous day. I mention this not as a footnote but as proof of the point. This is one wave with many faces. It punishes one region with heat, another with storms, and gifts a third with perfection, all at the same time because they are all just different positions along the same buckled ribbon of wind. When you understand that, you stop asking why so many different things are happening at once, and you start asking the only question that actually matters. Where is the wave going next, and what does it do when it gets there? There is one more ingredient in this pattern that I need to put in front of you now because it becomes the star of the show later in the week. Look at the very bottom of this system, at the trailing edge of the cold front that hangs down from the storminess in the east. That front is going to sag south, all the way down toward the Gulf of Mexico, and then it is going to stall. When a front stalls over very warm water, strange things can happen. The energy along that boundary does not just dissipate. It can get pinched off, cut away from the main flow, and left to sit and spin over the warmest water in the region. And that, as we will see, is how you build a tropical system out of nothing. So even the quietest looking piece of this map, that thin line sagging toward the Gulf, is loaded. Nothing about this pattern is idle. I want to slow down for a second and make sure the central idea is locked in, because everything else we discussed today is going to hang off of it. The reason this week is worse than a typical July stretch is not that any single element is unprecedented. Strong storms happen, heat waves happen, the Gulf spins up systems every hurricane season. The reason this is different is that all of these ingredients have been arranged by one pattern into a sequence, and that sequence points at the East Coast. Strong shear where it usually is not, a tropical threat where the season had been quiet, and a locked, slow-moving wave holding the whole arrangement in place long enough for each piece to actually happen instead of falling apart. That is the difference between weather and a pattern. Weather is a single roll of the dice. A pattern is someone loading the dice and rolling them again and again. There is a phrase forecasters use for a setup like this, where a slow, amplified wave keeps firing hazard after hazard from the same configuration. They call it a loaded pattern, and once a pattern loads, the only thing left to figure out is the order the shots come in. We already know the first one. It comes tomorrow, over the north woods of Maine and the farmland of southern Quebec, and it comes in the form of storms that this part of the country is genuinely not used to seeing. So let us go there. Let us walk through exactly what tomorrow looks like, hour by hour, and understand why a place that thinks of itself as safe from this kind of weather is about to find out that no place really is. Part 3. Rockets over the North Woods. Tomorrow morning, if you live in northern New England, you will probably look outside and see nothing that worries you. Maybe a few showers drifting down from Quebec, up near Drummondville, a little rumble of thunder in the distance. It will feel like an ordinary summer morning, a little humid, a little grey. Do not let that fool you. The morning is not the story. The morning is the calm while the atmosphere finishes loading itself, and the real event is going to detonate in the afternoon, when the sun has done its work and the disturbance coming down out of Canada arrives over an air mass that has been heating and moistening all day. Let me set the stage the way a forecaster reads it. By midday tomorrow, that dome of high pressure I described is shoving east, and the northwest flow along its edge is fully switched on. Coming down inside that flow is the cold pocket of air aloft, and underneath it, at the surface, warm and humid air is streaming up from the south. The gap between those two, warm below and cold above, is where all the energy lives. The technical way to say it is that the lapse rates are steepening, which just means the temperature is dropping off very fast as you climb, and that difference is what lets air parcels rise explosively once they get going. Layer on top of that the 50+ knots of shear turning the winds through the depth of the atmosphere, and you have both halves of the recipe in the same place at the same time. You have the fuel and you have the spin. That combination is why tomorrow is not a garden variety thunderstorm day. It is a supercell day, in a place that rarely gets one. By around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the forecast has several rotating supercells developing across the region, from southern Quebec down into northern Maine. And this is the window where that number I opened with, the significant tornado parameter reading of 8 near Quebec, comes into play. I want to explain what that index actually is because it is not a made-up scare number. It is a recipe score. Forecasters take the amount of instability in the atmosphere, the amount of low-level and deep-layer wind shear, the amount of spin already present in the lowest part of the atmosphere, and how low the cloud bases are, and they combine them into a single value that has been calibrated against decades of real tornado events. The higher the value, the more the environment resembles the environments that have historically produced strong tornadoes. A value of 1 is meaningful. A value of 8 is the atmosphere screaming. And to see a value like that at the latitude of Quebec is, to put it in the words one forecaster used looking at the same map, just bonkers. It helps to understand what forecasters are actually looking for on radar once these storms fire, because it explains how a warning gets to your phone in the first place. A mature supercell has a very particular anatomy. There is the main updraft, the powerful rising column of air. As the storm rotates, radar can detect a region of spinning air within it. The mesocyclone, and on the radar's velocity display it shows up as a tight couplet of winds moving toward the radar right next to winds moving away, a signature meteorologists can spot in seconds. On the reflectivity display, the part that shows where the rain is, a classic supercell often carves out a shape like a hook curling around the back of the storm, the hook echo, which marks where the rotation is wrapping precipitation around the developing circulation. When a forecaster sees a tightening velocity couplet and a hook echo at low levels, that is often the moment a tornado warning goes out, sometimes before anyone on the ground has seen a thing. Tomorrow, in that zone from Quebec down into Maine, those are the signatures the warning meteorologists will be hunting for, and when they find one, the clock on getting people to shelter starts running in minutes. There is one more piece of supercell anatomy that matters for tomorrow, and it is the part that actually reaches the ground. Behind the updraft, a current of dry air descends and wraps around the back of the mesocyclone. Forecasters call it the rear flank downdraft, and it plays a strange double role. It can help tighten the low-level rotation into a tornado, and it can also at times be what finally chokes the storm off. The tug-of-war between the updraft pulling air up and that downdraft pushing air down, right at the base of the storm, is where a tornado is made or denied. In an environment as favourable as tomorrow's, with the low cloud bases and the rich low-level spin the parameters are showing, that tug-of-war tips toward tornado more often than it does on an ordinary day. This is the fine machinery underneath that number 8, and it is why forecasters are not just watching for storms tomorrow. They are watching for storms that have this specific dangerous architecture. Now, I always want to be careful here, because there is a difference between the atmosphere being capable of something and that something actually happening. A high significant tornado parameter does not mean tornadoes are guaranteed. It means the ceiling is high. It means that if storms form and organize, and some of them will, the environment will support the worst end of the spectrum rather than the mild end. And the official outlook reflects exactly that tension. The government's severe weather forecasters have placed a large chunk of northern New England and adjacent Canada under an enhanced risk, which is a level 3 out of 5 on their scale, surrounded by a slight risk at level 2 and a marginal risk at level 1. Inside that enhanced zone, they have drawn a 15% chance of a tornado within roughly 25 miles of any given point, and, crucially, they have hatched that area, which is their way of flagging the potential for significant tornadoes, the EF2 and stronger kind. They have drawn a 30% wind area, hatched for gusts that could exceed 75 to 80 miles an hour, which is hurricane force, and they have drawn a 15% hail area, hatched for hail larger than 2 inches. Every one of those hatched zones is the forecasters telling you the same thing the parameter is telling you. The ceiling on this event is high. Think about what a 75 to 80 mile an hour wind gust does in a place like northern Maine or the mountains of New Hampshire. This is a heavily forested region. It is full of tall, shallow-rooted trees standing in soft summer soil, and it is threaded with power lines that run for miles through the woods. Winds at that speed do not just knock down a few branches, they snap trunks, they flatten stands of timber, and they drop lines across roads that emergency crews then cannot even reach because the same trees are blocking them. A significant wind event in this terrain can take the power out for days and cut small towns off entirely, and that is before we even talk about the hail or the tornadoes. The wind alone, across this landscape, is a serious threat, and it is the one the forecasters actually think is most likely to be widespread. But it is the tornado potential that makes tomorrow historic, and to understand why, you have to appreciate how deeply this region considers itself exempt. Ask most people in Maine or Vermont whether they worry about tornadoes, and they will look at you like you asked whether they worry about earthquakes. It is simply not part of the mental map. The storms that this environment can produce tomorrow, discrete supercells with the rotation and the low cloud bases that spin up strong tornadoes, are a Great Plains phenomenon in the popular imagination. They belong to Oklahoma and Kansas, not to Aroostook County. And that gap, the gap between what the atmosphere is capable of tomorrow and what the people underneath it expect, is itself a danger. Because preparedness is a habit, and you do not build the habit for a threat you have been told your whole life does not visit you. That, more than any single wind gust, is what keeps me up about this particular setup. The ingredients are rare here, and so is the readiness. So the question becomes, how did the North get an environment that looks like the Southern Plains in spring? What is it about this specific pattern that assembles a Kansas recipe over Quebec? The answer takes us into the anatomy of these northern storms, and to a warning from just a few years ago, when this exact kind of setup did something to Pennsylvania that no one there was ready for either. Because tomorrow is not without precedent. The precedent is just recent enough, and quiet enough, that most people have already forgotten it. Part 4. The anatomy of a storm that should not be here. If you want to know what a northwest flow severe weather setup can do to a part of the country that does not expect it, you do not have to imagine. You can just look back a few years, to late July of 2021, when a pattern remarkably similar to tomorrow's set up over the northeast. On that occasion, in a landscape not so different from the one about to get hit tomorrow, storms rolling southeast in northwest flow dropped an EF2 and an EF3 tornado in Pennsylvania. An EF3 tornado carries winds of well over 135 miles an hour. It is not a rope twister that skips across a field and lifts. It is the kind of tornado that removes roofs and levels well-built homes. And it happened in a place, and in a pattern, that told everyone beforehand that it was not really tornado country. That is the analogue for tomorrow, not a Kansas outbreak, a northern one in the woods, under a fast northwest flow in the heart of summer. And if you think the Northeast has never truly paid the price for a tornado, the history says otherwise, which is exactly why complacency here is so misplaced. On the 9th of June, 1953, a violent tornado tore through Worcester, Massachusetts. A storm rated at the top end of the intensity scales used at the time, with winds well over 200 miles an hour. It carved an 84-minute path of destruction and killed 94 people, injuring well over 1,000. It remains one of the deadliest tornadoes in the recorded history of the entire country, and it happened in central Massachusetts, not in Oklahoma. Decades later, on the 31st of May, 1985, an enormous tornado outbreak ripped across Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, and into Ontario, Canada, producing dozens of tornadoes, including some of the most violent ever documented in the region, and killing scores of people on both sides of the border. The North does get these storms. It gets them rarely, which is the mercy. But when it does get them, the toll can be catastrophic precisely because so few people are ready. That is the shadow hanging behind tomorrow's forecast. Let me also make the intensity scale concrete, because I keep referring to an EF2 and an EF3 and I do not want those to be abstract. The scale we use to rate tornadoes today is called the Enhanced Fujita scale, and it runs from EF0 at the bottom to EF5 at the top. It does not measure the wind directly because almost no instrument ever survives inside a tornado. Instead, it works backward from the damage, matching the destruction to the wind speed that would have been required to cause it. An EF0 is minor damage, some branches down, shingles peeled. An EF2, which is the floor of the significant category, and what the hatched zone on tomorrow's map is warning about, means winds of roughly 111 to 135 miles an hour, strong enough to tear roofs off houses, snap or uproot large trees, and toss cars. An EF3, like the one that struck Pennsylvania in that recent analog event, means winds up to about 165 miles an hour and the near total destruction of well-built homes. When forecasters hatch a tornado area, they are specifically telling you that the environment can support that significant EF2 or stronger end of the scale. It is not a formality. It is the difference between a storm that scares you and a storm that levels the block. So let me pull apart why this flow, specifically, is so good at manufacturing violent storms in the north. It comes back to the geometry of that western ridge and the trough digging into the east. Along the boundary between them, the winds aloft are not only fast, they are angled. They cross over the low-level winds at a sharp angle, and that crossing is what generates shear. And there is a second gift the pattern provides. The air coming down from the northwest off the top of that ridge and out of Canada is genuinely cold at altitude, which is unusual in July. When you drape that cold air aloft over the warm, sticky surface air of a New England summer afternoon, you create a very steep temperature drop with height. That steepness is like priming a pump. It means that any parcel of air that starts rising will keep accelerating upward, faster and faster, because it stays warmer than its surroundings all the way up. A forecaster looking at that profile would tell you the cold air aloft is acting like rocket fuel, and that is not hyperbole. It is a literal description of how the energy is being stored. Now combine the two. You have explosive vertical energy from the steep lapse rates, and you have strong turning of the winds with height from the shear. Air that starts to rise gets tilted and stretched by the shear as it goes, and stretching a rising column of air is exactly how you concentrate spin, the same way a figure skater pulls in her arms and speeds up. The storm organizes into a rotating updraft, a mesocyclone, and once that structure exists, everything else becomes possible. The rotation suspends hailstones in the updraft long enough for them to grow to the size of a baseball before they finally fall. The same rotation, if it reaches down and tightens near the ground, becomes a tornado. This is why the significant tornado parameter combines these ingredients into one number. They are not independent threats. They are all children of the same rotating structure, and tomorrow that structure is going to exist over a place that is not used to hosting it. I keep coming back to the hail, because it is such a vivid marker of how anomalous this is. Baseball-sized hail means hailstones close to 3 inches in diameter, and stones that large are heavy enough and fast enough to break windshields, dent roofs, strip trees, and seriously injure anyone caught outside. To grow a stone that big, the storm's updraft has to be ferociously strong enough to hold a lump of ice aloft against gravity while it accretes layer after layer of frozen water. The mere fact that the atmosphere over New England can support hail of that size tomorrow tells you how powerful these updrafts are going to be. It is a symptom, and it points back again to the same root cause, the enormous reservoir of instability that the cold air aloft and the warm surface air have created between them. There is a phrase that captures why the government forecasters are so concerned, and it has to do with the word discrete. In many severe weather events, especially in summer, storms quickly clump together into a big messy line. Lines are dangerous, mostly for wind, but they tend to compete with each other for the available energy, and that competition limits how strong any single cell can get. What is forecast for tomorrow afternoon, at least in the early stages, is different. The storms are expected to be discrete, meaning separate, standing apart from one another with clear air in between. A discrete supercell does not share. It gets the entire buffet of instability and shear to itself, and it can mature into its most dangerous form. Discrete supercells in a high shear, high instability environment are the classic tornado producers, and their presence in the forecast is the single biggest reason the tornado threat tomorrow is not just present but potentially significant. Let me connect this back to the larger point, because it would be easy to get lost in the machinery of a single day. The reason we are spending this much time on one afternoon in Maine is that this afternoon is the clearest, earliest proof of the thesis of this entire video. The thesis is that one pattern is aiming a sequence of hazards at the eastern United States, and that the hazards are worse than usual precisely because the pattern is putting ingredients where they do not belong. Tomorrow's storms are that thesis in its purest form. Plain-style supercells in the North Woods in July, because a western ridge and an eastern trough have conspired to route a cold Canadian disturbance over a warm New England surface with 50 knots of shear on top. Once you see that clearly, you understand that everything else this week, the weekend siege, the thing in the Gulf, is going to run on the exact same logic. Ingredients delivered to the wrong place by the same wave. But the atmosphere does not care about our theses. It just unfolds, hour by hour, and for the people actually living underneath it tomorrow, the map and the parameters resolve into something much more concrete. A specific town, a specific time, a specific decision about whether to be paying attention when the sky changes. So let us leave the machinery behind for a moment and walk through the actual timeline of tomorrow evening, because the where and the when of this event carry their own warnings. Part 5. The hours that matter. The first thing to understand about tomorrow's timeline is that the dangerous window arrives late, and that lateness is itself a hazard. The storms are not expected to reach their peak until the afternoon and evening, and some of the most violent activity may not push into the population centres of Maine until well after dinner. That means a real chance of strong storms, including rotating ones, arriving in darkness. Nighttime tornadoes are statistically far deadlier than daytime tornadoes for a reason that is almost painfully simple. You cannot see them coming. People are asleep or winding down or not watching the sky, and the warning has to reach them some other way, through a phone that has to be turned on and turned up. Keep that in mind as we walk the clock, because the where matters, but the when may matter more. The numbers on this are stark, and they are worth knowing before we walk through the timing. Studies of tornado fatalities have found that tornadoes striking at night are roughly twice as likely to kill as those that strike during the day, even when the tornadoes themselves are no stronger. The reasons compound one another. Visual confirmation is gone, so the natural warning of seeing a dark, rotating wall on the horizon never comes. Outdoor warning sirens, where they exist, are designed to be heard outdoors, and most people are inside and asleep. And the last line of defense becomes the wireless emergency alert on your phone, which only works if the phone is on, charged, has its alerts enabled, and is loud enough to wake you. For a region like northern New England that is not conditioned to treat a summer night as a tornado threat, every one of those links in the chain is more likely to be weak. That is why I keep hammering the point about turning your phone's alerts on tonight, before you go to bed. It is not a small thing. In a nighttime event, it may be the only thing. There is a particular vulnerability I want to name directly, because it shows up in the fatality data again and again. Manufactured and mobile homes offer very little protection against even a weak tornado, and a disproportionate share of tornado deaths occur in them. If you live in one, anywhere in tomorrow's risk zone, your plan cannot be to ride it out at home. Your plan has to be to identify, in advance and in daylight, a sturdier building you can get to quickly, a neighbour's basement, a community shelter, a solid public building, and to go there the moment a warning is issued rather than waiting to see what the sky does. The people who survive these events are almost always the ones who decided what they would do before the warning came, not the ones who tried to figure it out in the dark with the wind already rising. And since the words themselves save lives, let me make sure two of them are crystal clear, because they get confused constantly. A watch and a warning are not the same thing. A watch means the ingredients are in place, and dangerous storms are possible in your area over the next several hours, the way you might watch the ingredients on a counter and know a cake could be baked. It is the signal to stay alert, keep an eye on the sky, and know your plan. A warning means it is happening now, that a dangerous storm or a tornado has been detected on radar or spotted on the ground, and that you should take shelter immediately. Watch means get ready. Warning means go. Tomorrow, if you are in that northern New England and adjacent Canada zone, you may well see a watch issued in the afternoon covering a wide area, and then, if storms organise, individual warnings for specific towns as the evening goes on. The watch is your cue to stop what you're doing and pay attention. The warning is your cue to already be where you're going to be safe. Early in the day, the action is to the north, up around Quebec near Montreal and Drummondville, where the first storms fire in the morning. Those are the opening act. The main event builds through the afternoon as the atmosphere destabilises, and by around 5 o'clock in the evening, the forecast has several discrete rotating supercells developing, some of them right in that zone near Quebec where the significant tornado parameter is spiking toward 8. From there, the storms ride the northwest flow southeastward, and they aim straight into Maine. The specific towns in the path in the 6 to 8 o'clock evening window include places like Presque Isle, Clayton Lake, and Jackman, up in the north and west of the state thinly populated country where help is far away and the trees are everywhere. Then, from roughly 9 to 10 o'clock at night, that same line of storms is forecast to press further southeast into more populated territory. We're talking about Berlin, New Hampshire, and down through Bangor, Maine, and toward Portland. This is the part of the evening I want you to circle if you live in that corridor. By the time these storms reach Bangor and Portland, it will be full dark, and the storms will still be capable of damaging wind, large hail, and, if any cell holds its rotation, a tornado. As the night wears on and the storms try to push toward Nashua and Boston, they should begin to weaken, because the fuel that daytime heating provides shuts off after sunset and the atmosphere slowly stabilizes. So the far southern cities may get the tail end, a round of gusty storms in the overnight rather than the full-strength supercells. But north and west of a line from roughly Concord up toward Portland tomorrow evening is the real deal, and it deserves to be treated that way. I want to talk directly to anyone in that zone for a moment, because this is where a weather video stops being interesting and starts being useful. If you live in northern or interior New England, or across the border in southern Quebec or Ontario, tomorrow is a day to have a plan before the sky changes, not after. That means knowing where you would go if a warning is issued, ideally a small interior room on the lowest floor away from windows. It means making sure the alerts on your phone are turned on and loud, because with storms arriving after dark, that phone may be the only warning you get, and it means not dismissing a tornado warning because you have never had one before. The whole danger of a rare event in an unprepared place is precisely that people talk themselves out of believing it. Do not be the person who watches the storm from the porch because your town has never had a tornado. Tomorrow is the day that sentence stops being true for somewhere in that region. Now there is a version of tomorrow where the ceiling is not reached. That is worth saying plainly, because I never want to trade in certainty the atmosphere has not earned. It is possible that storms fire a little too late after the best heating is gone and stay just below their potential. It is possible they clump into a line faster than expected, and the tornado threat gives way to a mainly wind threat, which is still dangerous but different. Forecasting the difference between a significant event and a merely serious one 24 hours out is genuinely hard, and the honest forecasters will tell you the confidence in exactly how high-end this gets is lower than the confidence that something notable happens. But here is the thing about a loaded environment. When the ingredients are this favourable, you do not need every cell to reach its ceiling. You only need one. One discrete supercell that holds its rotation over the wrong town is all it takes to write the headline, and the parameters tomorrow say that at least one is likely to try. And this is exactly where the local story folds back into the national one. Because tomorrow's outbreak, as rare and as serious as it is for New England, is still just the first delivery. The same northwest flow that is about to route these storms into Maine is going to keep running all week, and the packages it carries are going to get bigger and hit more people. Tuesday is the North Woods. By the end of the week, the target shifts to the Interstate 95 corridor, to Washington and Baltimore and Philadelphia, where the population under the gun is measured not in the tens of thousands, but in the tens of millions. The engine that fires tomorrow does not rest, it reloads. And when it reloads, it points at the most crowded real estate in the country. So let us follow the wave south and see what it has in store for the coast once the New England storms have cleared and the atmosphere resets for round 2. Part 6. The conveyor reloads. After tomorrow's storms clear New England, there is going to be a lull. Wednesday looks quiet for most of the country, and Thursday is uncertain and conditional. If you only watched those 2 days, you might think the pattern had exhausted itself. It has not. It is inhaling. The same northwest flow that fired tomorrow's outbreak stays anchored over the eastern half of the country, and by Friday it is going to deliver its next package, this time not to the empty forests of the north, but to one of the most densely populated regions in the entire country. The government's severe weather forecasters have already, days in advance, drawn a severe weather risk across the mid-Atlantic for Friday, and inside that risk zone sit nearly 29 million people. Let me name the places, because the scale is the point. The Friday risk area covers Washington, District of Columbia. It covers Baltimore. It covers Philadelphia. It reaches down to Raleigh, North Carolina, and out to Virginia Beach. That is the beating heart of the Interstate 95 corridor, the chain of cities that runs up the East Coast and holds a huge share of the nation's population and infrastructure. When forecasters put a 15% severe risk on a region that many days out, over that many people, it is worth stopping to notice because they do not do it lightly. And the threat they are most worried about is not primarily tornadoes this time, it is wind. Specifically, it is the kind of long-lived, fast-moving windstorm that summer northwest flow specializes in producing. To understand the Friday threat, you have to meet a kind of storm system we have not talked about yet today, the mesoscale convective system. Picture what happens when a cluster of thunderstorms merges and organizes into a single self-sustaining complex, sometimes 100 miles across or more. These complexes generate their own cold pool of rain-cooled air at the surface, and that cold pool surges outward like water spreading across a floor, and along its leading edge it triggers new storms while producing a broad, powerful wall of straight-line wind. In the right environment, especially in fast northwest flow, one of these complexes can travel for hundreds of miles, staying strong the whole way, leaving a swath of wind damage behind it. When one of these events gets long and violent enough, it earns a specific name, a derecho, from the Spanish word for straight ahead, because the damage runs in a straight line rather than the twisting path of a tornado. Friday's setup is exactly the kind that can produce one. History gives us a chilling example of what northwest flow can do to this exact corridor. On the 29th of June, 2012, a derecho exploded out of the Midwest and raced roughly 700 miles in about 12 hours, from Indiana across the Ohio Valley and the Appalachians and straight into the Washington and Baltimore metro areas, packing wind gusts that in places topped 80 and even 90 miles an hour. It knocked out power to millions of people, and it did so during a brutal heat wave, which turned the outages from an inconvenience into a deadly emergency, as homes lost air conditioning in triple-digit heat. Dozens of people died. That storm is the textbook case of why forecasters get nervous when they see a strong ridge, a hot and humid air mass, and fast northwest flow all line up over the mid-Atlantic in summer, because that is the precise recipe that produced it. Friday's ingredients rhyme with that day, and while no two events are identical and I am not telling you Friday will be a repeat, the family resemblance is close enough that the professionals are watching it carefully. Let me explain the engine of a storm like that, the bow echo, because you can actually see it coming on radar. As a line of storms accelerates, the strongest surge of rain-cooled air pushes the middle of the line out ahead of the ends, bending the line into the shape of an archer's bow. That bulge is where the wind is worst, because it is being driven forward by a powerful current of air descending from the mid-levels of the atmosphere and slamming into the ground, then racing outward. Meteorologists have a name for the little pocket of extreme wind that can form on the leading edge of a bow, and radar can sometimes resolve the notch of dry air feeding it. When you see a line of storms bow out and accelerate on Friday, that is not the storm weakening. That is the storm organizing into its most dangerous form, and it is the moment the widespread damaging wind threat becomes real. And here is what makes the Friday environment so combustible, and this is where the whole pattern starts to feel less like a set of separate events, and more like a single story tightening its grip. Before a single storm forms on Friday, the atmosphere over the mid-Atlantic is going to be loaded to the breaking point by heat and humidity. Ahead of the storms, high pressure sitting over the Atlantic is going to pump warm, soupy tropical air up into the region. Heat indices are forecast to climb near 100 degrees from Washington to Philadelphia by the middle of the week, and across central North Carolina. Actual air temperatures are expected to reach 100 to 105 degrees Thursday into Friday. That heat is not a separate discomfort. It is ammunition. Hot, humid air is unstable air, and every extra degree loads more potential energy into the atmosphere for the storms to release when the trigger finally arrives. The heat and the storms are, once again, the same story. The heat is the loading, the storms are the firing. Forecasters actually have a way to measure that loading, and it is worth knowing the concept even if you never see the number. It is called convective available potential energy, and it quantifies exactly how much fuel the atmosphere has stored up for storms, essentially how hard a rising parcel of air would accelerate upward once it gets going. Hot, humid air near the surface, with cooler air above it, produces high values, and high values mean explosive potential. When forecasters look ahead to Friday and see the combination of that tropical air being pumped up from the Atlantic, the daytime heat baking the surface, and the disturbance arriving to trigger it all, they are watching the fuel gauge climb toward full. The storms that eventually break out on Friday will be releasing energy that the heat of the preceding days spent quietly building. This is why I keep insisting the heat and the storms are one phenomenon. The uncomfortable, oppressive days earlier in the week are not a separate weather event. They are the atmosphere charging its battery, and that timing lands on a corridor that will be full of people outdoors, which sharpens the human stakes considerably. The middle of July is peak season for outdoor life along the East Coast, ball games and festivals and beaches and every kind of gathering, and the heat indices climbing near 100 degrees from Washington to Philadelphia mean that even before a single storm, simply being outside in that corridor is going to be a physical strain. Anyone attending a large outdoor event in those cities in the days before Friday should be thinking about hydration and shade in the heat, and then thinking about where they would go if storms fire. Big open-air venues are exactly the places where a fast-moving wind event becomes most dangerous because there is nowhere to take cover and thousands of people to move at once. The combination of dangerous heat early in the week and dangerous storms at the end of it means the mid-Atlantic does not get a safe day in this stretch. It gets heat, and then it gets hit. Now, I have to be straight with you about the uncertainty here, because the forecast for Friday has already wobbled once. At one point, the forecasters trimmed part of the slight risk they had drawn across sections of the mid-Atlantic and the upper southeast, and in their discussion they acknowledged they might have to put it back. This is normal. A forecast 5 or 6 days out is not a photograph, it is a moving estimate, and the details of exactly where the heaviest storms set up and how strong they get will shift several more times before Friday actually arrives. But notice what is not wobbling. What is not wobbling is the big pattern. The northwest flow is locked in. The heat ahead of it is locked in. The disturbances riding the flow are going to keep coming. The uncertainty is in the aim of any single shot, not in whether the gun keeps firing. And that distinction between the reliable pattern and the uncertain details is the single most important thing to hold on to when you're trying to make sense of a forecast this far out. So Friday is the day the wave reaches the coast in force, and it is the day the largest number of people come into play. But Friday is not the end of it either. The pattern does not deliver one weekend package and quit. It stays active straight through the weekend and into the following week, hitting a different region each day, from the upper Midwest to the Great Lakes to the Ohio Valley to the southeast. A rolling series of severe weather threats all drawn from the same reservoir. And running alongside all of it, sometimes underneath the very same storms, is a second hazard that kills more people in an average year than tornadoes and hurricanes combined, and gets a fraction of the attention. Water. So let us follow the wave through the whole weekend, and see how a single pattern manages to threaten half the country with wind, and the other half with flood, at the same time. Part 7. A weekend that keeps reloading. If tomorrow is a single afternoon and Friday's a single day, the weekend is something else. A rolling siege that moves geographically from one region to the next without ever really letting up. Let me walk you through it the way the models are laying it out day by day, because the sheer persistence of it is the story. Start with Saturday. By Saturday, the focus shifts west and north into the upper Midwest. The European forecast model, which is one of the most respected pieces of guidance in the world, has been fairly insistent on a significant severe weather event setting up across Minnesota, Iowa and Wisconsin. All the hazards would be on the table there, but as with Friday, the wind threat looks like the headline concern. Then, as the weekend progresses into Sunday, a low-pressure system is forecast to plant itself over the Great Lakes, and that low becomes a new focus for severe weather across the Ohio Valley and toward the East Coast, with the tornado threat climbing back up the list of concerns on that day. And it does not stop on Sunday either, because into Monday, yet another round of severe weather may fire up and down the East Coast, from as far south as Alabama all the way back into New England. Read that sequence again. Saturday, the upper Midwest. Sunday, the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes. Monday, the entire East Coast. That is not a storm. That is a machine working its way across the map. The upper Midwest threat on Saturday deserves a moment of respect on its own, because that region knows exactly how bad a northwest flow wind event can get. On the 10th of August, 2020, a derecho detonated across Iowa and neighbouring states with winds that in places reached 140 miles an hour, equivalent to a strong tornado, but spread across a swath dozens of miles wide rather than a narrow path. It flattened an enormous share of the region's corn crop, damaged or destroyed tens of thousands of buildings, and caused damage measured in the billions of dollars, making it one of the costliest thunderstorm events in American history. That is the ceiling of what these Midwest wind events can reach when the ingredients max out. I am not forecasting a repeat of that this Saturday, and the odds of any single event reaching that extreme are low. But it is the reason the European model's insistence on a significant Saturday event across Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin is not something to wave off. At the very same time, down in the southeast, the pattern opens a separate front. For Sunday, forecasters have drawn a slight risk, a level 2 out of 5, across eastern Georgia and the Carolinas, and inside that zone sit close to 14 million people, including the cities of Charleston and Columbia. The setup there is a stalled boundary draped across the region, with the strongest storms expected where the wind shear is greatest, and the hottest, most explosive air sitting just to the south. That combination is a recipe for what forecasters call wet microbursts, rain-loaded downdrafts that crash to the ground and blast outward at 60 miles an hour or more, strong enough to bring down trees and power lines. And that southeast threat is forecast to slide down into northern Florida on Monday, extending the reach of this pattern almost to the tip of the peninsula. Let me explain the wet microburst, because it is the specific danger for the Carolinas and it is sneaky in a way tornadoes are not. Picture a storm that has lofted an enormous amount of water high into its updraft. When that water can no longer be held aloft, it collapses, and as the rain falls, it drags a column of air down with it. If that descending air passes through a layer of drier air on the way down, some of the rain evaporates, and evaporation cools the air sharply, making it denser and heavier, which accelerates the plunge. By the time that slug of cold, heavy air hits the ground, it can be moving fast enough to spread out in a violent, roughly circular blast of wind. It looks nothing like a tornado. There is no funnel, no rotation, just a wall of rain, and then, without warning, a sudden roar of straight-line wind that can flatten trees in every direction at once. On Sunday afternoon in the Carolinas, storms that look like ordinary heavy downpours can produce exactly this, which is why forecasters want people there watching the sky and the radar rather than assuming a summer thunderstorm is harmless. There is a wrinkle in the southeast setup that forecasters will be wrestling with, and it is worth a mention because it shows how much still hangs on small details. Along the eastern slopes of the Appalachians, a shallow layer of cool air can get trapped against the mountains, a phenomenon called cold air damming. Where that cool, stable air sits, it can actually suppress storms and keep an area quiet, while just outside its edge the atmosphere goes explosive. So the exact placement of that boundary on Sunday could be the difference between a calm afternoon and a dangerous one for a given town, and it is the kind of fine-scale feature that even good models struggle to pin down more than a day or two ahead. It is one more reason the honest forecast for the weekend is a range of possibilities, rather than a single certainty. And then, against all of that violence, the pattern offers one region a genuine gift, and I want to end this part on it, because it completes the portrait of a single wave wearing many faces. This coming Sunday, a strong high-pressure system sliding down from Canada is going to deliver some of the most beautiful weather of the entire year across the northern tier of the country. From the Pacific Northwest through the upper Midwest and into far northern New England, skies clear out. The humidity drops as dew points fall into the low 50s and even the upper 40s, and high temperatures settle into a perfect upper 70s and low 80s. Portland, Oregon, and Bangor, Maine, on the very same day, get postcard conditions, clean air, open window weather. It is worth savouring the strangeness of that. The same locked pattern that is dropping tornadoes on Maine on Tuesday hands that exact region a flawless Sunday 4 days later, because by Sunday that spot has rotated to a different position along the wave. One ribbon of wind, storms here, floods there, records in the west, and perfection in the north, all at once, all from the same shape in the sky. One wave, and it is touching Minnesota, Ohio, the Carolinas and Florida, within the span of about 72 hours. Now I want to turn to the water, because so far we have talked almost entirely about wind, and wind is not actually the deadliest thing this pattern is carrying. Across the Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee valleys, this same setup is producing a serious flash flood threat, and the mechanism behind it is one of the most dangerous in all of meteorology. It is called training. Picture train cars passing over the same stretch of track, one after another. When thunderstorms line up and move over the same ground repeatedly, each one dumping its rain on soil that is already saturated from the last, the water has nowhere to go. The steering winds that normally shove storms along and out of a region are forecast to collapse to almost nothing, which means the storms will rebuild over the same spots and unload rainfall rates that can exceed 2 inches an hour. The bullseye for that runs from western Kentucky down into the middle of Tennessee over ground that in some places is already flooding right now. There is a specific atmospheric ingredient behind this, and it has a name worth knowing: precipitable water. It is a measure of how much moisture is sitting in a column of the atmosphere, essentially how much rain the sky could wring out if it squeezed every drop from that column. When precipitable water values climb into the top few percent of what is normal for the time of year, as they are forecast to across the flood zone, every storm that forms becomes an extraordinarily efficient rain machine. Combine that saturated atmosphere with collapsing steering winds so the storms barely move, and you have the two ingredients that produce the worst flash floods: high rain rates and no motion to spread them out. This is the same mechanism that produced some of the deadliest flash floods in modern American memory. In May of 2010, storms trained over Middle Tennessee for 2 days and dropped well over a foot of rain on the Nashville area, causing catastrophic flooding that killed more than 20 people and inundated the heart of the city. The physics on display this week is the same physics that drowned Nashville, and it is aimed at some of the same ground. I keep circling back to the danger of the water rather than the wind, and I want to give you the number that explains why. Flooding is, in an average year, among the deadliest weather hazards in the United States, and the largest share of flood deaths happen in vehicles. When people drive into water, they misjudge. It takes only about a foot of moving water to float many cars, and about 2 feet to carry away most vehicles, including large ones. The water does not have to be deep or fast-looking to be lethal. It only has to be moving, and to be deeper than it appears in the dark, which it almost always is. That is the entire reason the oldest piece of flood safety advice endures, and the water threat does not stop there. Far to the south and west, across the hill country of Texas and southwest Texas more broadly, the government's precipitation forecasters are calling for 6 to as much as 10 inches of rain over the coming days, with flash flood risks running as high as 40% in the hardest hit zones from Tuesday through Thursday. The Texas hill country is some of the most flash flood prone terrain in the entire country, a landscape of thin soil over hard rock and steep narrow canyons that funnel water into fast rising walls. 6 to 10 inches of rain in that terrain is not an inconvenience. It is a genuine threat to life. And then, as we move deeper into the week, this whole flooding threat is forecast to migrate, spreading toward the central Gulf Coast by Monday, and then into the southwest monsoon by the middle of next week. We are going to be chasing a flood threat across the map for days. That migration is not random wandering, and it is worth seeing the logic of it, because it is the same logic that governs everything else in this forecast. The flood threat follows the moisture and the lift, and both are being steered by the pattern. As the days pass, the focus for the heaviest rain shifts with the position of the boundaries and the plumes of tropical moisture the pattern is drawing north. First it is the valleys of the Mid-South, then it slides toward the central Gulf Coast as the front sags and the Gulf moisture surges inland, and then the southwest gets its turn as the summer monsoon, the seasonal flow of moist air up into the desert states, ramps back up in the same window. So a family in Tennessee, a family on the Gulf Coast, and a family in Arizona could each face a flash flood threat on different days of the same week, and all three would be experiencing different expressions of one enormous slow-turning pattern. It reinforces the single lesson this whole week is teaching. Stop watching for isolated storms, and start watching the shape of the wave, because the wave is what decides who gets the water and when. I want to say something plainly here, the kind of thing that is worth more than any model map. If you come to a flooded road over the next several days, anywhere in these regions, turn around. Do not drive through it. It is the oldest advice in flood safety, and it stays true because people keep dying by ignoring it. A depth of water that looks harmless can float a vehicle right off the pavement, and moving water only needs to be a couple of feet deep to carry a car away. The overwhelming majority of flood deaths happen in vehicles, and almost all of them are preventable. The wind from these storms is dramatic and it makes the videos, but the water is what actually fills the obituaries, quietly, year after year. Respect it more than the part that is loud. So step back and look at what this single pattern is doing over one long weekend. It is firing windstorms across the upper Midwest on Saturday, tornado-capable storms over the Ohio Valley on Sunday, microbursts over the Carolinas, more storms down into Florida on Monday, and it is drowning the Tennessee Valley and the Texas Hill Country the entire time. Every one of those hazards traces back to the same amplified wave, the same ridge in the west and trough in the east, the same slow, locked configuration that will not move on and let the country breathe. And that raises an obvious question, one we have circled but not answered. What is holding this pattern in place? Why does it not just progress along and break down the way summer patterns usually do? The answer lives out west, inside the very heat dome we touched on earlier, and it is worth going back there now, because that dome is not just a side character in this story, it is the anchor that makes everything else possible. Part 8. The Dome That Started It All. Everything we have talked about so far, every storm, every flood, every rotating supercell exists because of what is happening in a part of the country where it is not storming at all. Out west, under clear skies and relentless sun, sits the engine of this entire week. It is the heat dome, and while it has been punishing the Intermountain West and the Northern Plains with historic temperatures, its real role in this story is structural. That dome is the western half of the wave. Its presence, and its refusal to move, is what locks the eastern trough in place and keeps the northwest flow pointed at the coast day after day. To understand why the east cannot catch a break, you have to understand why the west cannot cool down. We went deep on the heat itself 2 days ago, so I'm not going to relitigate all of it, but the headline numbers deserve to be back in front of you because they tell you how strong this anchor is. Across the Intermountain West and the Northern Plains, high temperatures have been running between 100 and 110 degrees, locally even higher, as much as 25 degrees above normal at the peak of the stretch. Salt Lake City has been challenging its all-time record high of around 107 degrees. Billings, Montana has been staring down 108. These are not just hot days. Some of them are among the hottest temperatures ever recorded in those places, in any month, in the entire period of record. And a dome capable of producing all-time records is a dome with enormous amplitude, which is exactly what it takes to force the jet stream into the kind of exaggerated wave we have been describing. Let me explain how a heat dome actually manufactures temperatures like that, because the mechanism is elegant and it matters for understanding why the dome is so stubborn. Under a strong ridge of high pressure, the air aloft sinks, and when air sinks, it is compressed by the higher pressure lower down, and compressing a gas heats it. This is the same principle that warms a bicycle pump when you use it, so the descending air under the dome warms as it sinks, and that warming suppresses cloud formation, which clears the sky, which lets more sunlight reach the ground, which heats the surface further, which reinforces the dome. It is a self-feeding loop, and it is why these patterns lock in and bake a region for days on end. Forecasters measure the strength of the ridge by the height of a particular pressure surface in the atmosphere, and the values under this dome have been running at the extreme end of the climatological scale, the kind of numbers that show up only in the most intense heat events on record. We have a recent and terrible benchmark for how far this can go. In late June of 2021, a heat dome of almost unimaginable intensity settled over the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. The village of Lytton, in British Columbia, reached 49.6 degrees Celsius, which is 121 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest temperature ever recorded in Canada, shattering the national record by several degrees. The very next day, Lytton was largely destroyed by wildfire. Across the region, that heat dome is estimated to have killed well over 1,000 people, many of them elderly and living without air conditioning in a place that had never before needed it. That is the extreme end of what a locked dome can do, and while this week's western heat is not at that apocalyptic level, it is drawn from the same family of patterns, which is why forecasters treat all-time record heat with the seriousness they do. And there is a quieter historical lesson folded into the overnight low danger I mentioned, one that killed on a massive scale. In July of 1995, a heat wave struck Chicago in which the nighttime temperatures stayed brutally high, denying people any relief after dark, and it killed roughly 700 people over the course of about a week. The daytime highs were dangerous, but it was the failure of the nights to cool that did most of the killing, because the human body needs the recovery that cooler nighttime hours normally provide. That is why forecasters watch overnight lows as closely as afternoon highs. When the nights will not cool, the heat stops being uncomfortable and starts being fatal, and it does so quietly, in bedrooms, without the drama of a storm. Here is the physical link, stated as simply as I can make it. A ridge of high pressure that strong bulges the jet stream far to the north on its western side, and to compensate, the jet has to plunge just as far to the south on its eastern side. The bigger the ridge, the deeper the downstream trough. So the same dome that is roasting Utah is, by simple geometry, carving out the trough that is generating storms over New England and the Ohio Valley. They are two ends of one seesaw. When people ask why the East is getting hammered, the honest answer is that the West got a record-breaking ridge, and a record-breaking ridge cannot exist without a powerful trough on the other side of it. The heat and the storms are locked together, not by coincidence, but by the conservation laws that govern how air moves around the planet. The dome carries its own dangers, of course, beyond its structural role, and they are worth naming because they round out the picture of a pattern that finds a way to threaten nearly everyone. Under that kind of heat, with humidity crashing below 10% and wind gusts around 30 miles an hour, the wildfire danger across parts of the interior West climbs sharply, particularly across eastern Idaho and southern portions of Montana and Wyoming. Dry fuel, low humidity, gusty wind, and a strengthening surface low to drive those gusts over the driest ground is the classic recipe for rapid fire spread. It is worth unpacking why those particular ingredients are so dangerous together, because each one amplifies the others. Extended extreme heat does not just bake the air, it bakes the vegetation, driving the moisture out of grasses, brush and timber until the whole landscape becomes tinder. When the relative humidity then crashes below 10%, the air itself becomes so thirsty that it pulls even more moisture out of those fuels and out of any fire's surroundings, so a spark that might fizzle on a normal day instead catches and runs. Add wind, and the wind does two things at once. It feeds the fire fresh oxygen, and it physically pushes the flames forward across that primed fuel bed, throwing embers ahead of the fire line to start new fires that merge into bigger ones. That is why forecasters issue what are called red flag warnings when heat, low humidity and wind line up, and it is why they're watching a strengthening surface low across parts of the interior West this weekend so closely. That low is the wind machine, and it is forecast to drive its strongest gusts over eastern Idaho and southern portions of Montana and Wyoming, exactly where the fuels are driest. A fire that starts under those conditions does not creep. It sprints, and it can outrun any plan you did not make in advance. There is a grim symmetry between this western fire danger and the eastern flooding we have already discussed, and it captures the whole personality of this pattern. On one side of the country, the same locked configuration is wringing so much water out of the sky that rivers are rising and roads are washing out. On the other side, that same configuration has baked the land so thoroughly that a stray spark could take out a mountainside. Too much water in one place, not a drop in another, both extremes generated by the identical stuck wave. When people ask whether this kind of pattern is normal, that simultaneity, historic fire weather and historic flooding in the same country in the same week, is the honest thing to point at. It is what a deeply amplified, stubbornly locked jet stream produces, and it is the signature of the pattern we are living under right now. And there is a quieter danger inside the heat as well, one we have hit before, and that deserves repeating because it does the killing. It is the overnight low, when the air stays dangerously warm through the night and never gives the body a chance to recover from the day's heat. That is when heat becomes lethal, and it is the same mechanism that made past heat disasters so deadly. The heat is not just uncomfortable. In the wrong conditions, it is the most dangerous weather there is, precisely because it is so quiet about it. There is a bit of relief written into the forecast for the West, and it matters for our story. A cold front is expected to drag cooler Pacific air into Montana by late Sunday into Monday, taking the edge off the worst of the heat there. But do not mistake that for the pattern breaking. The northern plains are forecast to stay dangerously hot, and into the middle of next week the heat is actually expected to build across the Midwest, with temperatures climbing back near 100 degrees at places like Minneapolis and Fargo. The dome flexes and shifts, but it does not leave, and as long as it holds its ground out west, the trough holds its ground in the east, and the conveyor keeps delivering storms to the coast. The anchor stays set. Which brings us to the most important consequence of all of this, and the reason the dome matters so much to the final act of our story. That same cold front, the one bringing a little relief to Montana, does not just fizzle out. It keeps sinking south, all the way down toward the Gulf of Mexico, dragged along by the pattern, and when a front like that reaches the Gulf and stalls over water that has been warming all summer, it stops being a cold front and starts being something else, a potential seed. Because the final thing this pattern is trying to do, at the far southern end of everything we have discussed, is the strangest and least certain of all. It is trying to build a storm out of nothing, over the open Gulf, from the leftover energy of a front that started as a cold snap in Canada. And whether it succeeds may be the single most consequential question in this entire forecast. So let us go south, to the warm water, and watch the Gulf try to make a storm from scratch. Part 9. Something the Gulf is building from scratch. For the first time in a while, forecasters have their eyes on the tropics, and I want to be careful and precise about what that means, because this is the part of the forecast where hype does the most damage and honesty does the most good. As of the latest overnight information, the National Hurricane Center's official 7-day tropical outlook says that tropical cyclone activity is not expected during the next 7 days. There is no named storm. There is no designated system. On paper, right now, the tropics are quiet. And yet, underneath that official quiet, something is starting to stir over the Gulf, and the models have been increasingly insistent that we should be watching it. Holding both of those facts at once, the official all clear and the growing model signal, is the only honest way to talk about this. Here is what the pattern is trying to do. Remember that cold front sagging south out of the storminess in the east, the one bringing relief to Montana before diving toward the Gulf. By the end of this week, roughly Friday into Saturday, that front is forecast to stall out down near the Gulf. And this is where the meteorology gets genuinely interesting, because what can happen next is a process forecasters describe with a very specific and very evocative word. They call it homegrown development. Most of the storms Americans worry about in hurricane season are imports. They roll off the coast of Africa as tropical waves, cross thousands of miles of open Atlantic, and arrive at our doorstep as fully formed systems. A homegrown storm is different. A homegrown storm is not imported from anywhere. It assembles itself, right here, out of local ingredients, when a piece of energy gets hung up over very warm water and simply refuses to leave. Let me walk through the mechanism because it is beautiful in a slightly menacing way. When that front stalls and the main flow moves on, a chunk of energy along the boundary can get pinched off, cut away from the jet stream that had been steering it, and left to sit. If that orphaned energy happens to be parked over the open Gulf, or just off the southeastern coast, it finds itself over some of the warmest water in the region, water that has been absorbing sunlight all summer. Warm water is fuel. It evaporates readily, feeding moisture and heat into the air above it, and if the winds aloft are light enough not to tear the developing structure apart, that pocket of energy can begin to organize. It can start to spin, and once it develops a closed circulation and a warm core, it stops being a leftover piece of a cold front and becomes a tropical system in its own right, born entirely at home. That is what the Gulf is trying to do this week. There is a threshold that governs whether this works, and it is one of the most important numbers in all of tropical meteorology. Tropical systems draw their power from warm ocean water, and the rough rule of thumb is that the sea surface needs to be at least about 26 degrees Celsius, roughly 79 degrees Fahrenheit, and warm to some depth for a storm to organize and sustain itself. The Gulf of Mexico in the middle of July is comfortably past that threshold, often by several degrees, which is precisely why forecasters take a stalled front over the Gulf in summer seriously in a way they would not in, say, March. The fuel is more than sufficient. What is uncertain is not whether the water can support a storm, but whether the other pieces fall into place. And the piece that matters most, the piece that decides between a storm and a dud, is wind shear. We spent the first half of this video talking about shear as the ingredient that makes northern thunderstorms rotate, and here is the beautiful, frustrating symmetry of the atmosphere. Shear is the enemy of a tropical system. The same tilting of the winds with height that organises a supercell will tear a fledgling tropical low apart, because a tropical storm needs to build a tall, vertically stacked tower of circulation, and shear leans that tower over and ventilates its core before it can consolidate. So the question of whether the Gulf spins something up comes down substantially to whether the winds aloft stay light enough over the developing low to let it build straight up. That is the knife edge these systems live on. Too much shear, and it never forms. Just enough calm, and it does. And in this particular setup, that calm is not guaranteed, which is a large part of why the models cannot agree. There is also an in-between category worth knowing about, because this system may spend time in it. Not every organised low over warm water is a pure tropical storm. Some are what forecasters call subtropical, a hybrid that has characteristics of both a warm core tropical system and a cold core mid-latitude low. These hybrids often form exactly the way this one might, from an old frontal boundary or an upper-level low parking over warm water, and they can transition into fully tropical systems if conditions allow. The Gulf and the waters off the southeast have a long history of producing these homegrown and hybrid systems, especially early and late in the season when fronts are still reaching that far south. So this is not exotic. It is a well-worn path to a named storm, and the atmosphere is standing at the trailhead this week. So what are the actual odds? This is where you have to watch the trend, not just the snapshot. Early in the week, forecasters were putting the chance of a tropical depression forming around the weekend at maybe 20 to 30%. More recently, the ensemble guidance has nudged that higher, with some measures now showing a 40 to 50% chance of a tropical depression developing over a roughly 15-day window in the highlighted zone across the northern and northeastern Gulf. Now, 40 to 50% is not a forecast that a storm will form. It is close to a coin flip. But the direction of travel matters. The odds have been rising, not falling, and the fact that multiple independent modelling systems keep generating a system in roughly the same place is the kind of agreement that makes forecasters lean in. If anything does develop and reach tropical storm strength, it would take the next name on the Atlantic list, a name forecasters have already been informally floating, Bertha. But I want to underline this because it is exactly the kind of thing that gets distorted. As of right now, there is no Bertha, there is a warm patch of water, a stalling front, and a rising probability. The name is a placeholder for a storm that has not been born and may not be. Here is the concrete thing to watch, the signal that will tell you the official view is shifting. Before the Hurricane Center ever names a storm, it first flags a region on its tropical outlook as an area to watch, shading it and attaching its own probability of development over the next couple of days and the next week. So the first real move will not be a name. It will be that shaded blob appearing on the Gulf with a percentage next to it in one of the outlooks issued every few hours. If you see that this week, you will know the official forecast has caught up to what the models have been hinting, and that the odds have crossed from something worth watching into something worth preparing for. Until that happens, the honest status stays exactly where it is. A rising model signal, no designated system, and a warm patch of water waiting to see what the rest of the pattern decides to do with it. There is a reason this particular setup is getting attention beyond the raw odds, and it connects back to something we have discussed on this channel before. We spent time earlier in the season on the pre-season outlook for the Atlantic, and on the warmed baseline of the world's oceans, the fact that sea surface temperatures across much of the globe have been running at or near record levels. A warmer Gulf is a more loaded Gulf. It means that when the ingredients for homegrown development come together, the water is more willing to give up its heat and spin something up, and to do it faster. So this is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening over an ocean that has been quietly stacking the deck all summer, which is part of why forecasters are treating a mid-July Gulf threat in a season that had been sleepy, with more seriousness than they might have a decade or two ago. There is a specific fear that a warm Gulf brings, and it deserves to be named even though it is not the most likely outcome here. It is rapid intensification, the phenomenon in which a storm strengthens explosively in a short span of time, sometimes leaping from a modest system to a major hurricane in a single day. What powers that leap is not just warm surface water, but deep warm water, a thick layer of heat that a storm cannot churn up and exhaust. Forecasters track this as ocean heat content, and the Gulf in particular is capable of building up enormous reservoirs of it, which is why some of the most infamous rapid intensification events in recent history have happened over exactly these waters. I want to be clear that the guidance for this system does not point at a rapid intensification monster. Most of the model members keep it modest, but the ingredient that makes rapid intensification possible, a warm and deep Gulf, is present, and that is the reason forecasters never fully relax about a Gulf system in the heart of summer, even one that starts as a humble homegrown low. The floor for this storm is a flooding rainmaker. The ceiling, unlikely as it is why nobody looks away. This connects directly to something we discussed earlier in the season, when we looked at the pre-season outlook and at the record warmth in the world's oceans. A warmer baseline does not mean every storm becomes a hurricane. What it means is that the dice are loaded, that when the atmospheric ingredients do align, the ocean is more willing to give up its heat quickly, and storms can organize and strengthen faster than the old rules of thumb would suggest. That is the backdrop against which this Gulf setup is unfolding. It is not the whole story, and it's not a reason to panic, but it is a reason the 40 to 50% development odds are being taken seriously, rather than dismissed as a mid-July fluke. But here is the honest heart of this part of the story. The models do not actually agree on what happens next. Some of them take this setup and build a genuine tropical storm that comes ashore on the Gulf Coast. Others take the very same starting point and produce almost nothing, just a sloppy area of heavy rain that never organizes. That disagreement is not a flaw in the forecast. It is the forecast. It is the atmosphere telling us honestly that it has not decided yet. And to understand the range of what could unfold, from a soaking that floods Florida to something that strengthens into a named storm and turns toward the coast, we have to look at what the individual models are actually showing, and why the smartest thing a forecaster can say right now is that the spread itself is the message. Part 10. When the models disagree. If you want to understand how forecasters think about a system that does not exist yet, the best thing you can do is stop looking for the answer and start reading the disagreement, because the disagreement is where all the real information lives. So let me take you through what the major guidance is actually showing for this Gulf setup, and I promise the picture that emerges is more useful than any single confident prediction could ever be. Start with the model that, by most accounts, saw this first. One of the newer artificial intelligence-based forecast models, a system trained on decades of atmospheric data, began hinting at this Gulf development several days ago, before the traditional models caught on. That model shows a weak area of low pressure developing over the northeastern Gulf around the coming weekend, and then slowly deepening. It is worth pausing on what these AI models actually are, because they are new enough that most people have no idea they exist, and they are quietly changing forecasting. For decades, weather models worked by solving the physics equations of the atmosphere directly, dividing the world into a grid and calculating how air, heat, and moisture move from one time step to the next. That is still how the traditional models work, and it takes enormous supercomputers. The new generation is different. These are machine learning models trained on decades of past atmospheric data that have essentially learned the patterns of how weather evolves without being told the equations explicitly. They run in a fraction of the time and, increasingly, they rival or beat the traditional models at certain tasks, including sniffing out developing systems a little earlier. That is exactly what happened here. The AI guidance flagged this Gulf setup before the conventional models fully caught on, and the fact that the traditional European model later came around to a similar idea is part of why forecasters are paying attention. When an old physics-based model and a new pattern learning model, built on completely different principles, arrive at the same answer, that agreement carries real weight. Let me also make sense of those pressure numbers I keep quoting, because they are the language these models speak. Air pressure at the center of a storm is a proxy for its strength, and lower means stronger. A typical fair weather sea level pressure is around 1,013 millibars. A weak tropical low might be 1,008. By the time you're talking about a strong tropical storm, you're down near 1,000 or the very high 900s, and a hurricane drops well below that, with the most violent storms in history reaching down into the low 900s and even the 800s. So when the guidance takes this Gulf system down toward 996 millibars, it is describing a respectable tropical storm, not a monster, but nothing to shrug at either. With that yardstick in hand, watch how this model walks the pressure down over time. This guidance takes the low from around 1010 millibars on Sunday down to about 1004 by Monday, and then, roughly 8 days out, down to around 996 millibars off the Florida Panhandle, which would be a solid tropical storm. It then brings that system ashore along the Gulf Coast around the middle of next week and lets it meander, which is the worst possible behaviour from a flooding standpoint, because a slow storm rains on the same place for days. Now bring in the traditional European model, one of the most trusted names in forecasting. It shows something broadly similar, which is exactly the kind of independent agreement that raises eyebrows. It develops a low in the Gulf, deepens it into the low on thousands of millibars, brings it to a technical landfall near the Florida Panhandle, and in one particular run does something that got a lot of attention. It strengthens the system as it moves inland, pulling it up to near 1,000 millibars over the Georgia and South Carolina line, and then tracks it further inland on a path that resembles a past devastating storm. I want to handle that last detail very carefully, because it is precisely the kind of thing that spreads across the internet stripped of all its context. That inland strengthening follow a terrible precedent scenario is one run of one model at the far edge of its useful range, and it represents a low probability outcome, not a forecast. It is worth knowing that the possibility exists in the guidance. It is not worth losing sleep over, and it is absolutely not worth telling your neighbours that a specific catastrophe is coming, because at this range that is simply not what the science supports. Then there is a third major AI model, and it tells almost the opposite story, which is why the honest headline here is uncertainty. That guidance keeps the energy hung up over land, over the southeast, over Georgia and Alabama and the Carolinas and Florida, where it never really consolidates into a proper Gulf system at all. And that is a genuinely live possibility. If the energy stays over land instead of getting out over the warm water, it cannot develop a real tropical circulation, and the whole tropical storm scenario collapses into a prolonged, messy rain event instead. So you have one model that sniffed out a landfalling storm, another that agrees with the developing low, and a third that says it may never get its act together at all. 3 respected tools, 3 different endings. To cut through the noise of any single model run, forecasters lean on something called ensembles, and this is worth understanding because it is how the pros actually manage uncertainty. An ensemble is not one forecast, it is dozens of them, run with tiny variations in the starting conditions, so that instead of a single answer, you get a spread of possible answers, and more importantly, a sense of how likely each one is. The main European ensemble runs 51 separate members, and when you look at those members for this Gulf setup, you see exactly the picture you would expect from a genuinely uncertain situation. A large number of members develop some kind of system. They scatter it in different directions. Some curve it up into the Carolinas and Georgia, some let it meander along the Gulf Coast, some race it up the eastern seaboard. Most of the members that do develop something keep it at tropical storm or depression strength, but a minority spin it up to hurricane strength pressures. That spread is not a failure to forecast. It is an honest map of the possibilities, and the honest reading of it is that development is a real and rising possibility. The track is genuinely unknown, and the intensity is probably modest but not guaranteed to be. This is also the right moment to say something about those forecast maps you've surely seen, the ones with a bundle of coloured lines fanning out from a storm, each line a different model's projected path. People call them spaghetti maps, and they are useful, but they are badly misread all the time. When you see 50 lines spreading across the Gulf and up the coast, the instinct is to panic, as though 50 different storms were coming. That is not what it shows. It is one possible storm, drawn 50 different ways, and the spread between the lines is a picture of the uncertainty, not a picture of the threat. A tight bundle means the models agree, and confidence is high. A wide fan, like the one this system is producing, means confidence is low, and the honest answer is that we do not yet know. The mistake is to fixate on the single worst line in the bundle and treat it as the forecast. The right way to read it is to look at where the lines cluster and to understand that any single one of them, including the scary one, is just one roll among many. The same discipline applies to the eventual forecast cone, if this system is ever designated. That cone, the one that widens as it extends into the future, does not show the size of the storm, and it does not show where the impacts will be. It shows the range of likely positions of the storm's centre, and it is deliberately drawn so that the centre stays inside it only about 2/3 of the time. Impacts, especially rain and wind, routinely extend far outside it. Every hurricane season, people just outside the cone assume they are safe and are proven wrong by the water. So if this thing gets a name and a cone in the coming days, hold these rules in your head. The line is not a promise, the cone is not the storm, and the rain does not read the map. Here is the part that I think matters most, and it is the part that survives no matter which model turns out to be right. Regardless of whether this thing gets a name, it is going to rain, and it may rain enormously. The setup favours a large plume of tropical moisture getting drawn up over the Gulf Coast and the southeast, and the 10-day rainfall projections show above normal precipitation across the northern and northeastern Gulf and much of the eastern United States. Forecasters are already flagging significant flooding potential from New Orleans eastward to Tampa, with Florida singled out as possibly the hardest hit. And this is the crucial reframing. You do not need a hurricane to have a disaster. A slow, disorganized, unnamed blob of tropical moisture parked over Florida for 3 days can drop more water and do more damage than a fast-moving named storm that comes and goes in an afternoon. The flooding threat is the near certainty here. The named storm is the wild card riding on top of it. Do not let the drama of the wild card distract you from the thing that is actually likely to happen, which is a whole lot of water over the southeast. So we are left with a system that officially does not exist, that the models cannot agree on, and that may or may not earn a name, but that is very likely to soak a large stretch of the Gulf Coast either way. And there is one more piece of physics that could tip the whole thing from a manageable rain event into something more serious, one final move the atmosphere has left to make. It involves the same trough, the same dip in the jet stream that has been driving all of our severe weather in the east, reaching down and grabbing this Gulf system by the collar. Forecasters call it the scoop, and it is where the two halves of this entire story, the northern severe weather and the southern tropical threat, finally collide into one. That is where we're going to end, because that is where the real mystery of this forecast lives. Part 11. The Scoop. Everything in this forecast has been building toward a single moment of physics, and it happens this coming weekend, when the two halves of the story we have been telling reach out and touch each other. On one side you have the trough, the deep dip in the jet stream over the eastern United States, that has been the source of all our severe weather, from the New England outbreak tomorrow to the weekend siege across the coast. On the other side you have the homegrown system trying to organise over the warm Gulf. For most of the week, those two things have been operating at opposite ends of the map, the north and the south seemingly separate. But the pattern is not going to let them stay separate. As the trough digs down this weekend, it is forecast to reach south, dive down toward the Gulf, and scoop that developing tropical energy up into itself. Forecasters have been watching for exactly this move, and it is the reason some of the model runs strengthen the system so dramatically as it moves north. When a mid-latitude trough captures a tropical or near-tropical low, the two can combine, and the interaction can inject fresh energy into the system, giving it a boost it could never have generated on its own. The technical name for this added energy source is baroclinic energy, which comes from the sharp contrast between warm and cold air masses, as opposed to the warm core energy a pure tropical storm draws from the ocean. When a storm can feed on both at once, on the warm Gulf water below and the energy of the diving trough above, it can intensify in ways that surprise people, and it can do it while moving north, even over land, which is not how tropical systems are supposed to behave. That is the scenario hiding inside those model runs that take a modest Gulf low and turn it into something that strengthens as it heads inland toward the southeast. It is not magic, it is the trough handing the storm a second engine. This process is well documented, and it runs in both directions. Sometimes a mid-latitude trough absorbs a tropical system and the storm loses its tropical character as it merges, a process forecasters call extratropical transition, which is what typically happens to hurricanes that curve north and slam into the northeastern states or Atlantic Canada, often expanding into huge, sprawling wind and rain events as they go. But sometimes the interaction works the other way, at least for a while, and the trough's energy reinvigorates the system before it winds down, briefly making it stronger and larger than it was as a pure tropical storm. The reason this matters so much for our week is that a storm getting a baroclinic boost can hold together and even intensify over or near land, which defies the usual expectation that tropical systems weaken the moment they leave the warm water. That is the specific, unusual behaviour lurking in the model runs that strengthen this system over Georgia and the Carolinas. It is not the model malfunctioning, it is the model capturing a real, if uncommon, piece of physics, the handoff of energy from the diving trough to the dying storm. There is a reason forecasters cannot tell you today which side of this the atmosphere will land on, and it comes down to the hard limits of predictability. Whether the scoop works depends on timing measured in hours, and positioning measured in tens of miles a week out. Get the trough there a day too early or 100 miles too far west and it grabs nothing. Get it there just right, and it lifts a storm toward the coast. The atmosphere is a chaotic system, which does not mean random but means exquisitely sensitive to tiny differences in its starting conditions, so that two nearly identical setups can diverge into completely different outcomes a week later. That sensitivity is the whole reason we run those 51 ensemble members instead of trusting one forecast, and it is why, standing here today, the only intellectually honest thing to say is that both futures are open and that the next few days of data will close one of them. And this is the moment where the whole architecture of this forecast reveals itself as one thing. Think about what the scoop actually means. The very same feature that is going to drop baseball-sized hail on Maine tomorrow, the same dip in the jet stream, the same amplified wave, is the feature that may reach down this weekend and lift a Gulf storm toward the east coast. The tornado threat in the north and the tropical threat in the south are not two stories that happen to be occurring in the same week. They are the same feature, acting at both of its ends. When I told you at the very beginning that this was one pattern, and not a series of coincidences, this is what I meant taken to its logical conclusion. The wave that punishes the north reaches down and grabs the south, and ties the entire week into a single knot. And this is exactly the point where, every time a week like this sets up, a very different explanation starts spreading online, so let me meet it head on because I would rather you hear it discussed honestly here than absorb it unchallenged somewhere else. When people see a rare tornado outbreak in the north, record heat in the west, floods in the middle, and a storm spinning up in the Gulf, all in the same week, a certain conclusion feels almost irresistible. This cannot be natural. Someone must be doing this. The claim usually attaches to a familiar list of suspects: government weather modification programs, cloud seeding, a certain antenna array in Alaska, or a vague, all-purpose word like geoengineering, and I understand the pull of it. When the weather feels coordinated, the mind reaches for a coordinator. So let us actually weigh it, the way we weigh everything on this channel, against the physics. Start with the sheer scale of the energy involved, because this is where the idea collapses first. A single ordinary thunderstorm releases energy comparable to a large nuclear weapon. A heat dome the size of the western United States, or the deep trough carving down over the east, involves the movement of energy on a scale thousands of times larger still, the redistribution of heat across an entire hemisphere. There is no technology on Earth, secret or otherwise, that can inject or steer energy on that scale. We cannot build a 50-knot shear environment over Quebec. We cannot bend the jet stream into a ridge and a trough on command. We cannot raise the temperature of the entire Intermountain West by 25 degrees. The energy budget simply does not close, not by a factor of 10, but by a factor of many thousands. Cloud seeding, the one weather modification technology that actually exists and works, can under narrow conditions coax a bit more precipitation out of a cloud that is already there and already primed to rain. That is the whole of its power. It cannot create a storm, cannot steer one, and cannot manufacture a tornado outbreak or a heat dome. Asking it to do any of that is like asking a garden hose to fill the ocean. Then there is the claim that the Gulf storm specifically is being manufactured, hurricanes on demand. But everything we spent the last two parts describing, a stalling front, warm water past the 26-degree threshold, energy pinching off and organising where the shear is low, is ordinary, well-understood meteorology that forecasters have watched play out for as long as we have had satellites. The homegrown genesis is not exotic and it is not secret. It is in the textbooks. And the scoop, the baroclinic handoff from the trough, is the same physics that governs storms every single season. Nothing here requires a hidden hand. It requires only the atmosphere doing what the atmosphere does. The deepest version of the claim is the one about coordination itself, the feeling that so many hazards at once must be orchestrated. But that feeling is a known trick of the human mind. We are pattern-finding animals, superb at spotting intention, even where there is none, and when independent-looking events pile up, we instinctively knit them into a plan. The truth is both simpler and, in a way, more astonishing. There is no coordinator because none is needed. All of these hazards are downstream of one thing, the shape of the jet stream this week. One buckled ribbon of wind, one ridge, one trough, and everything else. The tornadoes, the heat, the floods, the Gulf storm follows from that single configuration by the ordinary laws of physics. It only looks coordinated because it is connected, and it is connected by the wave, not by a plan. That is the entire thesis of this video, and it is a far more interesting truth than the conspiracy, because it means you can actually see the machine, understand it, and prepare for it, instead of being frightened by a phantom. I will give the last word on this to honesty, because that is what the channel is for. There is one low-probability model run that takes this Gulf system inland along a path resembling a past and terrible storm. It exists. I told you about it. And the responsible thing is to hold it exactly where the science holds it, as a possibility with a low probability attached, not as a prophecy. The line between taking a threat seriously and spreading fear is the number attached to it, and that number is the difference between preparation and panic. So we keep the number attached. Always. So here is the fork in the road, the genuine uncertainty on which everything hinges, and I'm going to lay it out as plainly as I can because this is the decision the atmosphere has not yet made. Down one path, the trough dives at the right time and in the right place, scoops up a Gulf system that has managed to organise over the warm water, gives it a baroclinic boost, and steers a strengthening storm toward the eastern United States. That is the higher-end outcome, the one where the season's first homegrown Gulf storm gets a name and a track that matters to millions of people on the coast. Down the other path, the timing is just off, or the energy never gets out over the water in the first place, and the trough scoops up nothing but a mass of moisture. In that case, the whole thing comes apart over land and leaves behind not a hurricane but a flood. Days of heavy rain over the southeast with no centre, no name and no track, but plenty of danger of its own. Both of those futures are alive right now, this evening, as you watch this. The models are split between them, and which one actually unfolds will be decided in the next several days by details too small for us to resolve yet. I find that genuinely remarkable and a little humbling, and I want to sit with it for a second before we close. We can see the whole shape of this pattern. We can see the ridge in the west and the trough in the east. We can see the northwest flow and the disturbance coming out of Canada and the front sagging toward the Gulf and the warm water waiting there. We can forecast days in advance that nearly 29 million people will be under a severe risk on Friday, and that the significant tornado parameter will spike toward 8 over Quebec tomorrow. We can do all of that. And yet the single most consequential question of the entire week, whether this pattern ends with a named storm turning toward the coast, or a nameless flood dissolving over the southeast, is still beyond our reach. The atmosphere shows us its structure freely and hides its final decision until nearly the last moment. That gap between how much we can see and how little we can be certain of is the whole drama of forecasting, and this week puts it on full display. Before we go, let me pull the entire week back into one frame, because it deserves to be seen whole. It starts tomorrow, with rare and dangerous storms over a corner of the country that does not believe it gets them, the significant tornado parameter screaming over the North Woods. It continues Friday, when the same conveyor reloads and aims a wind threat at the most crowded corridor in America. It rolls through the weekend as a siege that moves from the upper Midwest to the Ohio Valley to the Carolinas to Florida, dropping wind on half the country and drowning the other half. It is anchored the entire time by a record-breaking dome of heat in the west that refuses to move and, by refusing, holds the whole pattern in place. And it may end at the far southern tip of everything, with the Gulf building a storm from scratch and the diving trough deciding, at the last moment, whether to lift it toward the coast or let it fall apart into rain. One wave, one pattern, a dozen different kinds of danger from the border of Canada to the beaches of Florida, all of it running on the same buckled ribbon of wind 18,000 feet over your head. That is why this is far worse than a typical July storm. Not because any single piece of it has never happened before, but because all of it is happening at once, arranged by one pattern, aimed at one coast, in 1 week. A typical July storm is a roll of the dice. This is the whole table tilting. So I will leave you with the one question that everything else now waits on. The question that will define whether this week is remembered as a rough stretch of summer weather or as the beginning of the season's first real Gulf storm. In the next 24 to 48 hours, the National Hurricane Center will update its tropical outlook again and again after that, and somewhere in those updates, we will learn whether that warm patch of Gulf water gets circled as an official area to watch, so keep your eyes on that. When the trough dives down this weekend and reaches for the Gulf, does it come up holding the season's first named storm aimed at the East Coast, or does it come up holding nothing but rain? The atmosphere already knows. It just has not told us yet.